Like most other countries, Mexico is under assault by the three trends that will make up the New World: shifting trade patterns, inverting demographics, and spasming energy patterns. In Mexico's case, the resultant changes are almost completely positive, but there is still a dark side, and it will not be contained within Mexico's borders. Mexican geography is wretched. From an economic and political point of view, the country is far more fractured than even what the Canadians have had to contend with. Mexico has no navigable rivers whatsoever. Much of its territory is fully tropical or hard desert. Worse, nearly all of Mexico, whether temperate, jungle, or desert, is mountainous as well. Jungles are the worst biome from an economic development point of view. The unrelenting heat and humidity of jungle territories provides an endless array of biological diversity, including an endless array of diseases and disease vectors. The seasonal frosts and freezes of temperate climes not only inhibit the spreads of various pathogens, but also tend to kill off the insects that carry them. People living in the tropics have no such luck. High heat and humidity exacts a constant toll on infrastructure from roads to buildings. Maintenance costs tend toward the extreme because builders must choose between having to replace everything more often or using different and more expensive materials in construction. Then there is the simple fact that the basic technologies of modern road building, the use of heavy machinery and the drying of concrete, are rather hard to manage in a downpour. Asphalt softens on a hot day, and the tropics have hot to spare. Tropical soils are very thin and shallow, only retaining their fertility when they are part of a natural biome. That fertility comes from the constant recycling of the jungle's myriad plant species, and the process of clearing land for agriculture guts the cycle. Former jungles and rainforest lands, therefore, require constant fertilization to maintain agricultural production, even for tropical crops like bananas and yams. And if surrounding jungle lands are not cleared as well, then heavy pesticide use is a must, raising costs further, even as water quality declines. Often the tropics boast higher annual production totals per acre than temperate climes, because the heat and sun of the tropics frequently support more than one crop cycle a year. But that increased output comes at the cost of radically increased inputs. So more foodstuffs, yes, but the overall production is generally among the least efficient in the world. There are very few places on Earth where those farming the former jungle are not mired in poverty, and Mexico is no exception. Counteracting the effects of its tropical climate is Mexico's first challenge. The Mexicans addressed this by going uphill. Higher elevation mitigates heat and humidity, soil fertility has higher potential, and the cooler temperatures and thinner air work against diseases and their vectors. Most of Mexico's population, and all but 4 of its major cities, are nestled in the multitude of plateaus, highland basins, and mountain valleys throughout the country's midsection, where the elevation lifts the land out of the tropics into a more temperate environment. But that simply replaces the tropical challenge with a mountain challenge. Mountains, by definition, don't sport large tracts of flat land. There is no Mexican equivalent of the American Midwest that has the ability to generate scads of capital or support massive populations. Unlike other locations in North America, not one Mexican urban region has a hinterland. Chicago and St. Louis have the entire Midwest, New York City the Hudson Valley and Long Island, Orlando all of Central Florida, and the cities of the coastal southeast can draw upon the Piedmont. But when one leaves Mexico's highland valleys, one either hits deserts or jungles or mountains, or more likely, mountainous desert or mountainous jungle. Each mountain valley is limited in size and is more or less on its own. Any infrastructure that benefits one region cannot be extended to synergize with another. It must be rebuilt in each and every region without contributing to a greater whole. Mexico isn't split into 5 sections like Canada, but instead dozens, most of which cannot independently generate meaningful economies of scale. By far, Mexico's largest highland enclave is the greater Mexico City metropolitan area, home to 1 in 5 Mexicans and built on landfill. It isn't so much a good location as it is the best that the Mexican geography has on offer. Beyond Mexico City, only 10 Mexican metro areas pass the 1 million mark, break 5 million. The United States has 10. The economies of scale, abundant capital, and ease of development that the Americans take for granted and that make industrialization possible are all absent in Mexico. Transport, always the difficulty of the human condition, is more onerous in mountains than in any other terrain. Sharp elevation changes generate swift currents, meaning that not one of Mexico's rivers is navigable, naturally or otherwise. The Mexico core region of Mexico City sits at an elevation of about 8,000 feet, despite being only 200 miles inland. In comparison, Minneapolis sits at only 1/10 the elevation despite being 7 times the distance inland. Even when Mexico's disassociated regions manage to construct some local infrastructure, links between those regions require tackling topographic verticality that is painfully daunting not just to build but also to operate. Organic consumption growth is nearly impossible because what little capital there is must be dedicated to infrastructure. But even then, basic internal distribution is nearly impossible because of the extreme operating costs. It is a recipe for disconnected poverty and fractured, ineffectual government. Such difficult terrain skews what development that can happen into decidedly inegalitarian directions. In Mexico, the only people who can make a serious go are those who already have capital to spare. Those who could afford to build the expensive road and rail necessary to link a middling patch of useful land to the coast. Those who could afford to pay workers for months or even years to clear and fertilize land so that it might one day support crops. Most Mexican territory requires irrigation, further increasing the gap between those with capital and those without. Even the climate works against economic liberty. Tropical plantation crops like bananas and coffee require a great deal of capital to establish and a mammoth amount of unskilled labor throughout the crop's life cycles to tend, harvest, and ship. In comparison, temperate crops such as wheat, barley, and corn require little labor between planting and harvest, and the actual harvesting process is fairly light on labor. You can machine harvest or even scythe and thresh in pre-industrial times, a field of wheat in a very short period of time, but each bunch of bananas has to be harvested and carefully stored by hand. When an oligarch uses his money to build a road and a plantation and maybe even a port, that oligarch finds himself quite literally the ruler of all he sees. He has applied his wealth to make something out of nothing, and he is well aware that no one who works for him could have possibly done the same. He has little interest in sharing his investments with anyone else, even another oligarch. To do so would dilute the absolute economic and political power that he holds in his own personal fiefdom. Perhaps Mexico's biggest tragedy is that when, against very expensive odds, someone does manage to make a portion of Mexico functional, that someone has every interest in resisting contributing to a broader regional or national effort to replicate the success. To do so would jeopardize not only control over the sunk investment, but also the privileged economic and political position that comes with it. Whereas the United States was settled by the poor who became rich, Mexico was settled by the rich who commanded, and still command, the poor. These factors, low capital generation from a lack of cheap transport, high capital demand from infrastructure, limited land due to topography, a political and economic system geared towards regional jefes and their plantations, sharply limit the ability of the country to urbanize, much less industrialize.